He enslaves the people because they're becoming too numerous and becoming a threat. So he puts them to work and embitters their lives, building store cities of Pithom and Ramses.
The story of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt is one of the most significant and contentious narratives in the Bible. It's a tale of slavery, divine intervention, and liberation that has shaped religious and cultural views for millennia. Yet the historical veracity of the Exodus is hotly debated among scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. In this video, we will address two opposing viewpoints on the Exodus, examining the evidence and arguments for and against its historicity. Stick around for our response to this question. This will be revealed at some point in this video. The debate over the Exodus. Is this a historical fact or mere mythical allegory? The biblical account of the Exodus paints the Egyptians as cruel oppressors of the Israelites, a narrative that has significantly influenced how we perceive this ancient culture. But how much of this story is based on historical fact, and how much is rooted in myth? The Torah dedicates over 4 books to the narrative of the Israelites' enslavement and eventual escape from Egypt. According to these texts, the Israelites are portrayed as God's chosen people, further emphasizing the contrast between them and their Egyptian oppressors. This portrayal has contributed to a lasting image of the Egyptians as harsh rulers, overshadowing their achievements in other areas. Since both Christianity and Islam have roots in Judaism, the Exodus story has been incorporated into these religions and spread globally. This has cemented a perception of ancient Egyptians as an evil people, a view that persists even among many who identify as Black and discover their connection to this ancient civilization. The challenge remains to reconcile these historical narratives with the evidence, or lack thereof, supporting them. Proponents of the historicity of the Exodus argue that there is considerable evidence to support the biblical narrative. One of the key pieces of evidence comes from the Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions. These inscriptions were discovered by Sir Flinders Petrie at Serabit el-Qadim in the early 20th century and date back to between the 19th and 15th centuries BC. The Proto-Sinaitic script, developed by Semitic workers, possibly Israelites, provides a plausible means for Moses to have written the biblical texts. This discovery challenges the argument that Moses couldn't have written the first 5 books of the Bible due to the lack of an alphabetic script at the time. The Exodus account contains numerous Egyptian words indicating an authentic Egyptian context. For example, the Hebrew words for basket, bulrushes, pitch, reeds, and river are derived from Egyptian terms. This linguistic evidence supports Moses' Egyptian education and authorship of the texts. If Moses was educated in Pharaoh's household, as described in Acts 7:22, he would have been well versed in Egyptian language and culture, making the presence of these words in the Hebrew text a strong point in favor of the historicity of the Exodus. Another significant piece of evidence is Papyrus Brooklyn. This ancient Egyptian document lists 95 household servants, including several with Hebrew names, dating back to the 13th dynasty, around the time of Joseph. This papyrus provides evidence of Hebrews living in Egypt before the Exodus, supporting the biblical narrative. The presence of Hebrew names among the servants suggests that there were Israelites in Egypt during this period, lending credence to the biblical account of their presence and eventual enslavement. The Bible describes Israelites making bricks under harsh conditions in Egypt. Egyptian records, such as tomb paintings and papyri, depict similar scenes of brickmaking by slaves. These records align with the biblical account of the Israelites' labor. For instance, a painting in the tomb of Rekhmire, the vizier of Egypt under Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, depicts slaves making bricks for the workshops of the Karnak temple. This visual evidence supports the biblical description of the Israelites' forced labor in Egypt. Avaris, located in the Nile Delta, was the city built over by Ramesses and settled by Semitic people around the time of Joseph. Excavations have revealed a thriving community that matches the biblical description of the Israelite settlement and later enslavement in Egypt. Archaeological evidence shows that Avaris was initially settled by a group of non-Egyptians from Canaan, as evidenced by the Canaanite pottery and weapons found at the site. This aligns with the biblical narrative of the Israelites settling in Egypt and becoming enslaved. Amenhotep II, reigning in 1446 BC, is a strong candidate for the pharaoh of the Exodus. He spent significant time in the Nile Delta, likely encountering Moses. His reign shows a notable decline in military campaigns and a dramatic capture of over 100,000 captives, potentially replacing the Israelite labor force. This change in Amenhotep II's military activities and his efforts to capture a large number of captives suggest a significant event, such as the Exodus, that could have disrupted the labor force in Egypt. Seti I's relief at the Karnak temple depicts the eastern border of Egypt and likely the route taken by the Israelites during the Exodus. Geological studies support the existence of ancient canals and lakes that could correspond to the biblical Sea of Reeds. The Seti relief shows a waterway on Egypt's eastern border, which matches the description of the route the Israelites took when they left Egypt. This geographical evidence supports the plausibility of the Exodus route described in the Bible. Pharaoh Amenhotep III's Soleb temple inscription, around 1400 BC, mentions the land of the Shasu of Yahweh, indicating that Yahweh was known in Canaan during this time. This suggests a connection to the Israelites and supports the historical presence of Yahweh worshippers in the region. The Soleb inscription provides the oldest known reference to Yahweh outside of the Bible, suggesting that the worship of Yahweh was established in Canaan by the 15th century BC. The Berlin pedestal, housed in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, references Israel alongside Ashkelon and Canaan. This inscription, dating to the 15th century BC, supports the biblical timeline of the Israelites' migration to Canaan after the Exodus. The Berlin pedestal provides evidence of the presence of Israelites in Canaan during the time traditionally associated with the Exodus, supporting the historical basis of the biblical narrative. The Merneptah Stele, a victory monument from 1208 BC, mentions Israel as a nation in Canaan. This is the oldest non-biblical reference to Israel, supporting an early date for the Exodus and aligning with the biblical account of the Israelites' presence in Canaan during the Judges period. The Merneptah Stele provides crucial evidence that Israel was established in Canaan by the late 13th century BC, consistent with the timeline of the Exodus. So, what is the case against the historicity of the Exodus? While the previous points provide some evidence supporting the biblical narrative, critics argue that these findings are either misinterpreted or insufficient to prove the historicity of the Exodus. They suggest that the Exodus narrative may be an allegory, created to obscure the fact that the Israelites were actually native to Canaan. They question why Israelite writers would invent stories of foreign origins that seem to undermine their claims to their homeland. Some historians propose that these biblical traditions were likely created to give the Israelites a distinct identity and a sense of divine mission. Despite extensive archaeological efforts, there is no direct evidence to support the Exodus tradition. No Egyptian records mention the plagues or the Exodus, and the transient nature of nomadic life would have left little trace. Critics argue that the lack of evidence from the period traditionally associated with the Exodus is telling. The absence of Egyptian records referencing such a significant event as the Exodus raises doubts about its historicity. The Bible provides a detailed timeline for the Exodus, placing it around 1446 BC. However, some scholars argue for a later date, around the 13th century BC. This discrepancy is further complicated by the lack of consistency in the archaeological record and the absence of a definitive timeline. The debate over the dating of the Exodus highlights the challenges of reconciling the biblical narrative with the archaeological evidence. Archaeological evidence suggests that slavery, as described in the Bible, was not a common practice in Egypt. Egyptian society was structured around paid labor, and there is no word for slave in the Egyptian language. Monuments and writings from the time do not support the notion of widespread enslavement. Critics argue that the depiction of the Israelites as slaves may be an anachronism, reflecting later experiences of the Israelite people rather than historical reality. The biblical account of the Red Sea parting is often seen as a miraculous event. Critics argue that such an event is physically impossible, and likely a later addition to the narrative to emphasize divine intervention. The lack of geological evidence for such a dramatic event further challenges the historicity of the Exodus. The Bible states that 600,000 men, plus women and children, left Egypt, totaling around 2 million people. This figure is implausible given the population estimates of ancient Egypt. Critics argue that these numbers are exaggerated and not supported by archaeological evidence. The logistical challenges of moving such a large population through the desert further undermine the plausibility of the biblical account. Israeli historian Shlomo Sand has argued that Canaan was an Egyptian territory at the time of the supposed Exodus. This means the Israelites would have been fleeing from one part of the Egyptian empire to another, which contradicts the narrative of a dramatic escape from oppression. Sand's argument challenges the traditional understanding of the Exodus and suggests that the Israelites' migration may have been a more gradual and less dramatic process. Some scholars believe that the Exodus story was developed to create a distinct Israelite identity. The narrative served to distinguish the Israelites from their Canaanite neighbors, emphasizing their unique relationship with God and their divine mission. This perspective suggests that the Exodus story may be more of a theological construct than a historical account. The moral and ethical laws in the Torah are similar to those found in other ancient cultures, such as the Ugaritians and Babylonians. This suggests that the Israelites were not unique in their religious practices, and that the Exodus story was shaped by broader cultural influences. The similarities between the Torah and other ancient legal codes challenge the notion of the distinctiveness of the Israelite religious tradition. Many modern scholars and archaeologists, including those from Israeli institutions, admit that there is no direct evidence for the Exodus. Publications in respected outlets like Haaretz and the Jerusalem Post have acknowledged the lack of archaeological support for the biblical account. This admission from within the scholarly community underscores the challenges of proving the historicity of the Exodus. The debate over the historicity of the Exodus is far from settled. On one hand, there are compelling pieces of evidence that suggest the biblical narrative may have a historical basis. The Proto-Sinaitic inscriptions, the use of Egyptian words in the Hebrew text, Papyrus Brooklyn, the tomb paintings depicting brickmaking, the archaeological discoveries at Avaris, the reign of Amenhotep II, the Seti I relief, the Soleb inscription, the Berlin pedestal, and the Meneptah stele all provide pieces of the puzzle that support the plausibility of the Exodus. These findings suggest that there may be some historical truth to the biblical account, even if it has been embellished or altered over time. On the other hand, significant gaps and inconsistencies in the archaeological record and historical analysis raise serious doubts. The lack of direct evidence in Egyptian records, the physical implausibility of some of the biblical events, the exaggerated numbers, and the alternative explanations for the origins of the Israelites all challenge the historicity of the Exodus. Critics argue that the Exodus narrative may be more of a theological and ideological construct than a historical account. For believers, the Exodus remains a foundational story of faith and identity. It represents a divine act of liberation and a central moment in the relationship between God and the Israelites. For historians and archaeologists, it is a complex puzzle that continues to provoke inquiry and debate. The truth likely lies somewhere between the two extremes, requiring a nuanced and open-minded approach to uncovering the past. Ultimately, whether the Exodus is viewed as historical fact or mythical allegory, it remains a powerful narrative that has shaped the course of history and continues to influence our understanding of the past. The enduring legacy of the Exodus story is a testament to its significance in the religious and cultural traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Its themes of liberation, faith, and divine intervention continue to resonate with people across the world. Join us for part 2 of this video. Until then, let us know your thoughts. Is the biblical story true? Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.